In Northern California, a man sacrifices everything to prove his sister's death was no accident. A sympathetic detective with a brilliant theory becomes his only ally. A young woman vanishes, and everyone's convinced she's been murdered. Texas investigators have a suspect and a motive, but absolutely no proof. At least, not yet. A sexual predator terrorizes a quiet Colorado neighborhood. When his spree suddenly ends, authorities are left with no way to find him. Anyone can get away with murder, at least for a while. But as long as a murder remains unsolved, it also remains open. And justice favors the unforgotten. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. On February 22, 1985, Palo Alto, California police were dispatched to the home of James and Abigail Niebauer. 56-year-old James Niebauer told the officers that his wife Abby, one of Northern California's most acclaimed poets, had been accidentally shot. When officers made their way inside, they found the 47-year-old mother of three dead on the kitchen floor. She had suffered a massive shotgun blast to the chest. Police collected a partially disassembled antique shotgun lying on the floor a few feet from Abby's body. On a nearby table, police noticed polish, rags, and other cleaning supplies. Crime scene technicians photographed the scene. James Niebauer, a physical education therapist for a local public school system, explained what had happened. He said that his wife had left to run errands earlier that afternoon. James had just returned from a skiing trip with his youngest son. He worked to finish restoring an antique shotgun that he planned to give to one of his children as a gift. When Abby returned home a few hours later, he was anxious to show her the progress he had made. While she was admiring the workmanship on the barrel, the shotgun inexplicably fired. James had no idea that the old gun was loaded, nor could he explain why it fired. He couldn't believe that his wife of 27 years was gone. At autopsy, the coroner established the official cause of death as a gunshot blast to the victim's heart. Abby's death had been instantaneous. The examiner also studied the powder burns left on her blouse. Based on their size and location on the sleeves, he concluded the burn patterns were consistent with James's story, that Abby had been reaching toward the barrel when the shotgun misfired. But as news of the shooting began to spread through Palo Alto, Abby's friends came forward to police, convinced that her tragic death was anything but an accident. One close friend told police that James and Abby's 27-year marriage had turned bitter in recent years. The Niebauers, she said, had stayed together only for the sake of their three children. In fact, Abby planned to file for divorce after their youngest son left for college in a few months.
God, it will look just great.
Until then, Abby hoped to minimize the tensions in the house by converting the couple's garage into her own apartment. But James refused to let go. He would often explode into a rage, accusing Abby of seeing other men. Abby began to fear for her own safety. Despite James Niebauer's story to the contrary, friends were convinced that Abby would never have approached him as he held a weapon. Forensic technicians examined the old shotgun. After a thorough analysis, they could find no obvious flaws in the trigger mechanism that would explain why the shotgun had spontaneously fired. Nevertheless, when police reviewed all of the facts of the case, they concluded that Abby's death was consistent with an accidental shooting. The shotgun and Abby Niebauer's clothing were returned to her husband. More than 700 miles away in Olympia, Washington, Abby's brother, Lee Sansom, had been following the investigation. Aware of his sister's turbulent marriage, he also refused to accept that her death had been an accident.
I was very much surprised when a friend of my sister's sent me a newspaper clipping indicating that the shooting had been declared an accident by the police. That was completely the last thing that I thought would happen.
Abby's brother traveled to the Palo Alto District Attorney's office, hoping to convince them that this case demanded a closer look. Though he had no physical evidence, he believed he could establish a motive for murder. He said that just 2 weeks before Abby's death, the estate of their recently deceased parents had been settled. Abby's inheritance was $180,000. She confided to her brother that she planned to keep it in an account where James couldn't touch it. However, if Abby died before her divorce was finalized, the money would automatically go to James Niebauer, which is exactly how it was playing out. But ultimately, authorities weren't swayed. And Lee Sansom quickly realized that if he was going to find justice for his sister, he would have to come up with solid physical evidence on his own. As he struggled to find a way to expose his brother-in-law's crime, he received a letter from authorities in Palo Alto.
I got a letter back saying that they didn't really feel that there was any reason that the local prosecutor probably knew what they were doing, and that there was no reason for them to look further into it.
Unwilling to accept the official ruling, Sansom made a difficult decision. He quit his job as a computer programmer and began investing all of his time and money to finding justice for his sister.
Financially, I lost everything that I had put aside for my retirement and that I had inherited from my parents. And as I say, there were huge gaps of time in which I was waiting for some results. It was very difficult. Sounds like a good one.
8 years passed without a break. Then, Sansom learned of a survivors advocacy group called Citizens Against Homicide.
Good to hear from you.
They agreed to help him jumpstart the investigation. The group contacted the Palo Alto Police Department and persisted until authorities agreed to re-examine Abby's death. When homicide detective Michael Yore reviewed the files, he was surprised at what he found.
My first impression on this particular case was that there was a homicide that occurred. This was not an accident.
With Lee Sansom's help, Detective Yore, a firearms expert, retrieved the old shotgun and examined it for himself. It left him with more questions than answers.
How could you get a single shot shotgun, okay, where you have 14 pounds of pressure to cock the shotgun, How could you get something like that where you've taken the time to take the foregrip off, taken the time to take the stock off, unscrew all these parts, and then not notice that this is a single-shot shotgun that's loaded and cocked?
Take another look into this case.
The finding compelled detectives to reopen the case.
We're sorry about your mom.
They began by interviewing the couple's youngest son, who was living at home at the time of the shooting.
Angry.
He told police that just hours before his mother was killed, he and his father had decided to return home a day early from a skiing trip.
Wanted me to make a whole lot of noise. 6 hours is not bad.
When they entered the house, he said his father stopped suddenly, listening for a sign that Abby was there with another man.
Oh, nothing. Listen, why don't we
But
give you a couple
Abby wasn't
dollars?
home.
You've been away for a while.
His father seemed agitated and then suggested he go out and have fun that evening. The son thought this was peculiar, since his dad rarely let him go out, even on weekends.
To a movie.
He went and never saw his mother alive again. Detective Ure was convinced that James Niebauer had sent his son away for a reason. He didn't want any witnesses to the shooting. But until investigators could find a way to come up with solid physical evidence to prove murder, Abby's death would officially remain an accident. After 10 years, police in Palo Alto, California agreed to reopen the investigation into the death of 47-year-old Abby Niebauer, shot by her husband James as he worked to restore an antique shotgun. Though they now suspected she had been murdered, investigators lacked the physical evidence to prove it. Convinced that something had been overlooked years before, Detective Michael Ure examined the coroner's report. The medical examiner had stated that the powder burns on Abby's sweater were consistent with her reaching out toward the gun barrel when it fired. When Detective Ure viewed the photos for himself, he came to a different conclusion. The powder burns, he noticed, were on the outside forearm area of the sweater.
That doesn't match up with somebody reaching out and being shot directly into the chest. So that's what initially caused me to sit back and say, how else could it have happened?
Once again, on the 21st of
To find out, Detective Ure devised his own forensic experiment using the antique shotgun. With mannequins donated from a department store and white dress shirts from his own closet, the detective set out to replicate the powder burns on Abby's clothing, using James's version of events as his starting point.
22 inches from high.
But that scenario failed to reproduce the same patterns.
The arm is 27.
Ure continued to adjust the position of the mannequin's arms and his firing distance. After several days of test firing, he was finally able to replicate the burns on Abby's clothing.
On the chest.
At 11 inches away, the shotgun blast produced identical burn patterns. And the defensive position of the arms suggested that Abby Niebauer knew what was about to happen to her.
And now this changes the scenario from she was looking at the bright colors that were on the weapon itself, voluntarily having a shotgun placed at her heart and doing it with her consent, to her now having a shotgun placed at her heart and her in an Alfred Hitchcock terrified position.
An independent forensics authority confirmed Detective Ure's test results. And now, the Palo Alto District Attorney was convinced that James Niebauer had murdered his wife. James Niebauer, now 69 years old, was arrested at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport as he returned from a trip to Germany.
You have the right to remain.
He was extradited to California, where he stood trial for the murder of his wife. Police believe that James Niebauer recognized his marriage was over. And the only way to cash in on Abby's recent inheritance was to kill her before the divorce was finalized.
Abby, can you come here for a minute?
After sending his son out of the house, James loaded and cocked the old shotgun and waited patiently for his unsuspecting wife. As she stepped into the kitchen, he fired, killing her instantly. Later, he staged the scene to appear he'd been cleaning the weapon. In 1999, James Niebauer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. For the victim's brother, Lee Sansom, it was the end of a long struggle for justice, but not the end of the mystery.
I still wonder why Jim Niebauer could take my sister's life after being married to her for all those years, and do it in not in an angry way, but in a carefully planned way. And I still wonder how he could do that.
Though some homicide investigations can linger for years without a break, justice has a long memory. And advancing forensic technology can heat up an otherwise cold case. Houston, Texas, July 25th, 1987. In the afternoon hours, a road crew working along a rural highway prepared to finish up their day's work. Without warning, a passing motorist suddenly opened fire. One of the workers was hit in the leg. A co-worker managed to get the pickup truck's license number as the vehicle sped away. The information was quickly called into the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Within a few hours, Detective Marcel Dion had traced the tag to a car dealership owned by a man named Michael Neal. Police went to the car lot to interview Neal about the shooting.
Who are you?
But according to an employee there, a young woman named Tracy Jo Shine, Michael Neal wasn't around.
Is he here? Is Michael here?
Detectives asked her about his current whereabouts, but she was incoherent and seemed unable to answer any questions.
What you on? You want something? You look kind of funny.
Tracy Joe appeared to have probably had a shot or had taken some type of a drug, and I tried to get her to tell me where Michael Neal was, because that's who I was looking for.
You know if I sit down?
The officers asked to look around. Near Tracy Joe, the detective found a bag containing a powdery substance.
Hey, detective, I think you
And
need
in
to
the
come see
back
this.
room, the deputy uncovered a makeshift lab used for manufacturing methamphetamine, a potent form of speed.
Tracy, is this your stuff in this other room? You know who this?
Though Tracy Joe claimed to know nothing about that, she was placed under arrest. Bobby Neal, Michael Neal's brother and co-owner of the car dealership, was also arrested on drug charges. Now, with drug charges pending, Tracy Joe was willing to talk to police about Michael Neal.
Straight shooting.
And we're trying to look out for you, because this is no...
She said she and Michael were romantically involved.
I really don't think you were
In fact, the two shared a house.
And so what I...
But you can
Though she didn't know where he currently was, she told police that he was the man who had shot the road worker.
I gotta take you back in the lot.
She said that she and Michael Neal had gone out joyriding in his pickup truck. He was firing a handgun at random targets and thought it would be funny to shoot at the workers. Tracy Joe didn't know that he intended to actually hit them. She said she would be willing to testify against her boyfriend if police agreed to drop the drug charges against her. Until then, she refused to make an official statement. Tracy Joe was released on bail.
When she left that, she told me she would get back with me and help me with the case.
But more than a month went by without a word from the witness. Then, on September 9th, Tracy Joe's mother, Virginia Shine, came in to speak with police. She hadn't heard from her daughter in nearly 3 weeks. Tracy Joe Shine, the star witness in an attempted murder investigation, was now missing. Police in Harris County, Texas, were closing in on Michael Neal, the prime suspect in a random drive-by shooting that left one road worker lucky to be alive. Though Neal's girlfriend, Tracy Joe Shine, had agreed to testify against him, she was now missing.
You know what it is, and I know it.
Though the timing of her disappearance was suspicious, investigators had to consider that she had left town to avoid having to testify against her boyfriend. But then, Detective Marcel Dion received a call. A woman who wished to remain anonymous claimed to have information about a man who had murdered his girlfriend in their home.
Supposedly, the girl had been placed in a 55-gallon drum of muriatic acid and been dismembered just prior to that. The informant started relating to me the names involved, and she named Michael Neal and Tracy Joe Shine.
The informant heard rumors that the victim's remains had been transported to Michael Neal's car lot in a refrigerator after lying in his home for 3 days. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the premises of the car dealership. Though Michael Neal was not at work, Harris County authorities began searching the area. On the side of the building, technicians found an abandoned refrigerator. It was unplugged and wide open, as if it were being aired out. It appeared to have been recently cleaned, but as examiners soon learned, not thoroughly enough. Debris still clung to its surfaces, including what appeared to be a small fragment of flesh. Investigators collected the sample and sent it off to the lab for analysis. In 1987, DNA testing was in its infancy and required large samples. With such a small sample to work with, examiners were only able to conclude that the DNA extracted from the refrigerator was human and that it had come from a female. The process had consumed the entire sample, precluding any further testing. For investigators, the finding of female human tissue, however, supported the anonymous caller's statements that Tracy Joe Shine had been murdered. Looking to find additional evidence to corroborate the story, police searched Michael Neal's bedroom, where Tracy Joe's dead body had allegedly lain for 3 days. If Tracy Joe had been murdered there, police and forensic technicians could find no evidence to prove it.
You find anything? Anybody find anything?
Michael Neal's whereabouts also remained a mystery. In November 1987, 4 months after Tracy Joe's disappearance, investigators got a break. Michael Neal had been located in San Antonio. He was in police custody for having shot a man in the face. Through his lawyer, Michael refused to make any statements about Tracy Joe Shine's whereabouts. Though investigators believed he was involved in her disappearance, they lacked physical evidence.
If you bring a case like this in front of a jury, and a jury says, well, you know, what if we convict this guy, and then Tracy Joe shows up? And it's very hard to, when somebody disappears, to assume that this person is dead.
Investigators would have to find another way to make their case. They interviewed dozens of inmates serving time with Michael Neal, hoping the suspect had bragged about the murder. But other than rumors, no one had any useful information. For months, detectives searched the surrounding area, hoping any sign of the missing woman would turn up. But the investigation into Tracy Joe Shine's disappearance turned cold. And it would remain that way for the next 12 years. By 1999, Harris County detectives had formed a cold case squad to deal with a growing number of unsolved crimes. While assessing old files, they came across Tracy Joe Shine's case report. They agreed her disappearance demanded a closer look. And though more than a decade had gone by, Detective Roger Wedgeworth believed the passage of time could work to his benefit.
People get divorced. Wives are more likely to talk about an ex-husband than they are to talk about a present husband. People aren't threatened by individuals anymore. They could be incarcerated, something like that. So time helps us that way.
How you doing?
One of the people mellowed by time was Michael Neal's brother, Bobby, who had been imprisoned 12 years earlier for manufacturing methamphetamines. His parole hearing was coming up, and now he was willing to tell what he knew.
Whatever.
Bobby said that about the time Tracy Joe disappeared, he'd gone over to his brother's house. He found Michael in the garage, trying to load a taped-up refrigerator into his pickup truck.
Where do you want to put it?
Gonna put it in the truck.
The place reeked, and Michael was burning incense to cover the smell. Bobby helped his brother put the fridge on the truck. Then they drove it to the car dealership and unloaded it.
What happened to her? And he told
Bobby said he had no idea what was inside. Though he was being cooperative, investigators felt he had not told them everything.
We felt that Bobby had seen her body in the refrigerator, and we wanted him to tell us. And we felt that because he was incarcerated at that time, that we could possibly pressure him to tell the truth.
But the suspect's brother wasn't talking.
Would you like some help with that?
Still, the information he provided focused the investigation once again on the refrigerator.
You work with us, we'll see what we can do.
And fortunately, Detective Marcel Dion, who had worked the case 12 years earlier, had made certain that the evidence remained in police custody.
I don't know how many times everyone tried to get me to release that refrigerator so that they could get rid of it out of our property room, and I wouldn't let it go because I knew that was the only real piece of evidence that we had.
After dismantling the appliance, technicians went to work searching for evidence. They found and collected several biological samples that had gone previously undetected. Though investigators had no known samples from Tracy Joe to compare it to, the evidence was sent to GeneScreen, a DNA testing laboratory that opened in the year after Tracy Joe disappeared. But the police property room where the refrigerator had sat for 12 years was not climate controlled. And senior forensic scientist William Watson was not optimistic.
I did not believe
that there was a good chance of generating a DNA profile from the samples that they had, just because of the condition that they were in and the environment that they had been in.
And in fact, the samples were too degraded for conventional DNA testing. However, a new procedure was being developed. The technique, called mitochondrial DNA sequencing, looks at a specific strand of DNA in the cell nucleus that's passed unchanged from mother to child. Potentially, examiners could determine if the latest evidence recovered from the refrigerator had come from the biological child of Virginia Shine.
It was the perfect type of case for this sort of testing because every other type of testing had been exhausted. And we were up against the wall. There was really nothing that we could say about the samples that were found inside the refrigerator, except that back in 1987, they determined that they were from a human, and that was it. So if we didn't get a profile with mitochondrial DNA, we weren't going to have anything at all.
The procedure was a success. Examiners then compared the profile generated from the refrigerator to those of Tracy Joe's mother, Virginia Shine. The results were a match.
And then we look at the overall pattern.
And in a court of law, the tiny samples were enough to constitute the victim's deceased body. After 12 years of waiting, advanced forensic technology had provided investigators with proof that Tracy Joe Shine had been murdered. On January 1st, 2000, Michael Neal, imprisoned on unrelated charges, was confronted with the evidence that confirmed Tracy Joe's body had been in his refrigerator. Faced with the death penalty, he confessed to the murder.
It's in a strip mall.
He said that after learning that Tracy Joe was cooperating with police in the road worker shooting investigation, his anger turned deadly, and he strangled her to death. 3 days later, he cut up her body, placed it into the refrigerator, and then disposed of the remains. After pleading guilty, Michael Neal was sentenced to 45 years in prison for first-degree murder. When tackling a crime, investigators face two scenarios: a lack of clues to fit the suspect, or a lack of suspects to fit the clues. Fort Collins, Colorado, August 29, 1989. In the early afternoon hours, a real estate agent was showing prospective buyers a home in a desirable neighborhood. As they made their way into the master bedroom, they stumbled upon a gruesome find. The current homeowner, 39-year-old Sarah Dean, lay dead on the floor. After receiving the frantic 911 call, officers from the Fort Collins Police Department rushed to the scene. There, in the second-floor bedroom, they found the victim with a telephone cord wrapped tightly around her neck. Sarah Dean had also been sexually assaulted.
Right.
A spilled cup of water found near her body suggested she had been taken by surprise.
Tag it.
Police searched the nearby bathroom.
Chances are this has got a lot.
In the bathtub, they located debris that had been tracked in from the outside. The window was unlocked. For investigators, this marked the killer's likely entry point. Looking to uncover additional evidence, crime scene technicians applied a laser wand throughout the area, which causes the proteins found in bodily fluids to fluoresce. The laser exposed several stains.
Take a picture of this down here for me.
The samples were collected and preserved as evidence. As police processed the outside of the house, they located and collected a palm print on the locked kitchen window. but there was no telling when it might have been left there or by whom. No ladder marks or any other signs of a forced entry were found. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Sarah Dean had been brutally beaten before being sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The medical examiner collected additional biological evidence, and blood typing analysis confirmed that it matched all of the samples collected from the crime scene. It had all originated from one individual. Police turned to the recovered palm print to tell them who that was. Though the lift had provided a clear image of the palm print, a search through databases containing fingerprint records turned up no matches, until investigators could find a way to tie all of the evidence to a suspect. Sarah Dean's killer would remain a free man. Police in Fort Collins, Colorado struggled to solve the brutal rape and murder of 39-year-old Sarah Dean. And though they had collected incriminating physical evidence at the crime scene, they had no solid suspects to link it to. Using photographs taken at the scene, investigators worked to develop a profile of Sarah's killer. To reach the unlocked second-floor bathroom window, the suspect had to climb a fence, grab the gutter pipe, and then swing onto the roof. For investigators, that suggested that the perpetrator was young and agile, most likely a teenager. With an overwhelming amount of physical evidence to prove murder, Lieutenant Jim Broderick needed to find a way to identify the suspect.
I guess there was kind of a sense of confidence the whole time we were working it, is that we were finding evidence of the intruder. It was just a matter of identifying who the intruder was.
Lieutenant Broderick ran the victim's name through the law enforcement database. Sarah Dean's name had recently been entered into the system. She had filed a police report 10 days before she was murdered. According to the reports, Sarah called police after returning home late one night to discover that her home had been robbed. Among the items stolen were a tape player, a red and blue gym bag, 2 bottles of wine, and several pairs of black underwear. But the responding officers had found no signs of forced entry and no clues to the robber's identity. That investigation quickly went cold. For investigators, the fetish aspects of the robbery and the sexual nature of the homicide made it easy to connect the two crimes. Lieutenant Broderick speculated that the robbery might have been a sort of dress rehearsal for the young suspect.
He knew the general layout of the house, may have even known, based on the amount of time that he'd spent in the house, that on the prior occasion, 10 days earlier, that certain windows aren't locked.
Even though the evidence suggested the crime of a stranger, investigators couldn't yet eliminate the possibility that the killer was someone she knew. Police interviewed Sarah Dean's co-workers, friends, and acquaintances, starting with her fiancé. He told police that he and Sarah had recently become engaged and planned to marry in a few months. They were excited about their future together. Sarah was in the process of selling her home so they could purchase a new one together. He had no idea who could have done this to Sarah. Before releasing the fiancé, police collected blood samples. Serological tests later confirmed he was not the killer. Over the next several months, hundreds of local residents, including known sex offenders, were brought in for questioning. All were asked to submit blood samples.
I'll bet you there was 300 to 400 people that actually had blood samples drawn from them and compared to the evidence at the scene, but no one was being matched up.
The search for Sarah Dean's killer was turning up nothing. Then, in September 1989, a month after the homicide, Fort Collins police uncovered a clue. A car that had recently been reported stolen was found abandoned along the side of the road. Inside, the officer collected a baseball cap with the initials DT Jr. written on the brim. Believing teenagers had stolen the car, burglary detectives contacted area high schools and looked for students with those initials.
Thanks for coming in. Yeah, take a seat there for me, okay?
They found one. 16-year-old Douglas Thames Jr. was brought in for questioning.
You found something in it. I was wondering if you recognize it.
When asked about the hat, he claimed that he had lent it to some friends of his a few weeks earlier and never got it back.
You're definitely for sure. Okay.
With his mother present, Thames denied stealing the car. Within a few hours, police had located the two young men. They not only admitted stealing the car, they also confessed to being part of a gang responsible for robbing a few area homes. They showed police where they kept their stolen property. Among the electronics and other goods, police found a red and blue gym bag, like the one reported stolen by Sarah Dean 10 days before her murder. Officers confronted the teenagers with the evidence linking them to the homicide. But the boys denied any knowledge of it.
We did catch up.
And they refused to divulge the names of other teenagers involved in the robberies. Police collected blood samples and palm prints, but none matched the evidence recovered from the crime scene. For investigators, the setback was frustrating.
Over the course of the next 4 to 5 years, there's just nothing coming in. I mean, there's good leads based on people arrested in other jurisdictions for similar crimes, but you know, you do the serological testing, and it just doesn't match up with our crime scene.
6 years after Sarah Dean was found brutally murdered in her home, police were no closer to finding her killer. By 1995, 6 years had passed since 39-year-old Sarah Dean was found sexually assaulted and murdered in her Fort Collins, Colorado home. Though police had collected an overwhelming amount of physical evidence from the crime scene, they struggled to link it to a suspect. The case had ground to a halt. But in July of 1995, all of that changed. A heating technician working on a furnace in a rented house made a strange discovery. As he worked to fix a clogged air duct, he found several pairs of women's underwear stuffed inside. Recalling the details of the Sarah Dean robbery and homicide, he called police. Lieutenant Broderick responded to the call, hopeful that this could be the break that eluded authorities for years.
Up inside there? Yeah, that's...
When he saw the underwear, he realized they matched the description of those that had been reported stolen by Sarah Dean 10 days before her murder. The detective collected the items and forwarded them to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. There, Laboratory Agent Examiner Ted DeValis located and extracted biological evidence from several of the items. Even though the samples had sat for 6 years in a furnace air duct, Agent DeValis was confident that new DNA technology would allow him to obtain valuable evidence.
I would have been concerned of doing the old ABO typing and some of the protein markers, which are more subject to degradation. DNA is very stable, and again, what we do is we always go ahead and try to develop a DNA profile to see if we can be successful or not.
DeValis was able to develop a genetic profile of the suspect from the evidence recovered from the underwear. When that was compared to the biological evidence recovered from the Sarah Dean crime scene, DeValis concluded that all of the samples in this case had originated from one individual. Having established a physical link between the crime scene and the rented house, investigators raced to find out who had lived there at the time of the murder. Fortunately, the landlord kept meticulous records. He told police that in August of 1989, the house was rented to a family who had a few teenage boys. One was named Douglas Thames Jr., the teenager who had provided investigators with information 6 years earlier.
Here were their grandparents, I believe.
Yeah, they just came in.
A check of statewide records revealed that Douglas Thames Jr., now 22 years old, lived several hundred miles away in Grand Junction, Colorado. Armed with a court order to obtain blood samples and fingerprints from Douglas Thames Jr., Detective Broderick headed for Grand Junction. With Thames at his job site, where he worked as a roofer.
Detective Broderick, we're looking for a Doug Thames. You have one on your crew? Yes, sir. Copy that.
He was taken in for questioning.
You mind coming down?
After several hours, Thames remained uncooperative with police.
Doing all right, Douglas? In what city?
Convinced he was hiding something, investigators took handprints and collected blood samples before releasing the suspect.
Go straight up.
After developing a DNA profile from Douglas Thames Jr.'s known blood samples, Agent DeValis compared it to the evidence found at the crime scene and on the underwear recovered from the furnace. All of the samples matched. Fort Collins police had found Sarah Dean's killer. Police returned to Grand Junction, this time with an arrest warrant.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have...
Douglas Thames Jr. was taken into custody and charged with the 1989 murder of Sarah Dean. Police believe that 10 days after breaking into Sarah Dean's house, the 16-year-old returned, slipping in through the open second-floor bathroom window. Thames caught his victim completely off guard. Sarah Dean probably never knew what hit her. For the crime of first-degree murder, Douglas Thames Jr. was sentenced to life. When a homicide investigation goes unsolved, some killers feel safe to put their deeds behind them. Armed with patience and the latest forensic technology, investigators can heat up a cold case and find justice for the unforgotten. Police in Central California find themselves in the midst of a violent crime wave. At first, the deaths appear unrelated.
This is it.
But detectives uncover evidence that points to a single killer. In Virginia, women start turning up dead in their own homes. And it appears a sadistic serial killer is to blame. But until police can identify a suspect, they remain powerless to stop him. When there is no obvious connection between victim and killer, solving a murder can be difficult. But forensic experts can play a vital role in exposing the predator who chooses random targets. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. California's central coastline is famous for its rugged beauty and isolation. But in the early 1980s, the city of Santa Cruz became the backdrop for a series of violent crimes. On April 23rd, rescue workers and police from the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office responded to a call about a vehicle found burning along a rural mountain road. The car had been burning for hours and was completely destroyed. To authorities, it appeared to be the work of vandals. But a closer inspection revealed a much more gruesome act than arson. A human body, burnt beyond recognition, lay in the front seat. The unidentified victim was removed from the burned-out wreckage and transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Investigators began searching for clues to explain the fire. But they found none of the telltale signs suggesting that an accident or engine trouble were to blame. A check on the tags revealed the car was registered to 20-year-old Mark Farrell, who listed an address less than a mile from the scene.
1 Frank John Mary.
Detective Sergeant David Deverell oversaw the investigation. The lack of an obvious cause of the fire was troubling.
There was no reason for the car to have caught fire. There was no dynamic crash. It's very unusual to have, a body burnt up in a vehicle with no explanation as to how it happens.
Police hoped the autopsy would yield more answers.
This is Farrell.
With Detective Deverell present, forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Mason began his examination by x-raying the victim. After reviewing the results, it was clear this death was no accident.
I could see evidence of at least 3, possibly 4 bullet pathways through the chest, entering on the right and exiting on the left. There was also a very probable gunshot wound to the head.
The young male victim had been murdered. But the heat of the fire had destroyed any ballistics evidence that may have been left behind. But then, embedded in the young man's chest, Dr. Mason found a single bullet that had somehow survived the intense heat. Dr. Mason, a gun enthusiast, analyzed the fragment under a microscope. It was a unique bullet.
I'm a longtime handgun rifle shooter, and I recognized it immediately as a .38 special wad cutter. They are heavy, they're very penetrative, and they will drill deeply into a body.
Dental records later confirmed that the murder victim was in fact the owner of the burned-out car, 20-year-old Mark Farrell. Now, police had to find out who had killed him and why. Investigators questioned the young man's mother. She couldn't imagine why anyone would have wanted to harm her son. She said she last saw him the previous afternoon. Mark, a college student studying to be an engineer, was late for the night shift where he worked as an analyst at a nearby electronics plant. There didn't seem to be anything that was troubling him. Mark was well liked by everyone who knew him. He didn't have any enemies. With no obvious suspects, police looked to reconstruct the last hours of Mark Farrell's life. His employer confirmed that Mark had worked his entire shift the night before and left around 2 a.m. There were no indications that anything out of the ordinary had happened during his shift. And he said Mark got along well with all of his co-workers. The manager handed over the videotape from the company's security camera. At the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office, Detective Deverell reviewed the tapes.
It's the surveillance.
He watched as Mark Farrell left work without incident.
In looking at the tape, there was certainly nothing unusual in it. Looked like, it was the end of the night. He was headed home. There was absolutely nothing in it.
Weeks passed with no additional leads. Soon, the investigation turned cold. And the caseload for Santa Cruz homicide detectives was about to increase. 2 months after the murder of Mark Farrell, the tranquility of the nearby community of Laguna Beach was shattered. The lifeless bodies of 2 men were discovered on the beach. Officers and crime scene technicians were dispatched to the scene.
Right.
There, they found 2 young Asian men who had both been shot in the back multiple times. Police began processing the scene for clues. In the breast pocket of one of the victims, they found a wallet.
All right. See anything else? Or?
No, that's good. I got the shot. We can put him back down and
okay.
We'll check the wallet for ID.
Okay.
And inside was identification belonging to a man named Check Chin, a resident of San Francisco.
Got some.
Police could find no ID on the second victim.
Craig, is it okay if I come in from this angle here? Right.
His wallet was missing.
It looks like he's got a set of keys.
However, they located a set of car keys. Detectives theorized the double murder was the result of a robbery gone bad. Using the set of keys, police were able to locate the victim's car.
Let's get the distance between 2 and 7.
Based on the vehicle registration, they believed that the second victim was the car's owner, 30-year-old Han Lee, also from San Francisco.
Looks pretty good. So we'll get Dave in here and let him know what we're going to
How's it looking there?
As police began looking for clues to the killer's identity, they noticed one empty spot in the nearby parking lot. And in the space were fresh tire tracks.
Yeah, so we'll catch this guy and...
Unsure if the killer had left the marks, crime scene technicians collected the evidence using a plaster cast mold. The nature of the double murder troubled police.
It was a really unusual scene for us. We had 2 bodies up here on the trail. Multiple homicide is certainly something we don't see. It's something that concerned us greatly.
The victims' bodies were transported to the coroner's office for autopsy. Again, Dr. Richard Mason worked the case.
Sure. This, when you're done with the overviews, while he's in a position to get the ID shot.
He extracted the fatal bullets from the victims' backs. He had seen them before. They were unique .38 caliber wad cutters, identical to the bullet recovered from the body of Mark Farrell 2 months earlier. Police now had 3 unsolved murders on their hands, and it appeared the same gun had been used in all of the homicides. Dr. Mason and Detective Deverell realized it was too much of a coincidence to be ignored.
It's an unusual gun.
Police in Santa Cruz, California had 3 unsolved homicides on their hands. And the bullets recovered from all of the victims appear to have originated from the same gun. To find out, the bullets were forwarded to ballistics expert Paul Doherty at the San Mateo Police Crime Lab. From the size and diameter, he confirmed that all were .38 caliber wad cutter bullets. Typically, wad cutters are used for target shooting.
A wad cutter is a projectile that's designed to punch a hole in paper for target shooting. So you get a nice clean hole so you can measure your accuracy of your score. In other words, in some cases when you get right on the line, you want to make sure you're cut. If you've cut the line, the score goes higher, and that's what this does. It just cuts a nice clean hole.
Each gun leaves unique markings on a bullet as it travels through the barrel. When examiners compared the bullet recovered from 20-year-old Mark Farrell to the ones taken from the 2 Asian victims found at Laguna Beach, they found that all shared the same characteristics. And after extensive research, authorities determined that the markings left on the bullets had likely been produced by a rare Great Western single-action revolver.
Manufacturer and see if we can't get somewhere with that. Although it becomes a little problematic when you start looking.
It was a promising lead, but it was nearly impossible for police to track down everyone who currently owned the handgun.
I don't think it's a standard manufacturer.
And though it seemed unlikely, Detective Dave Deverell had to consider that the 3 murders were unconnected.
Between that and the gun, we'll get there. You look at it and go, well, maybe the gun got passed from one person to another, and there really is no connection between the cases. That didn't work for any of us. It just didn't make sense that a gun and bullets would somehow transfer from one person to another and be used again in another homicide.
To find out if there was a connection, detectives traveled to San Francisco's Chinatown district, where the 2 Laguna Beach victims, Han Lee and Chek Chin, had lived. It's a notoriously insulated community, and investigators realized that getting information would not be easy. A team from the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office worked the case. Homicide Detective Joe Hennard uncovered a possible lead.
We had information that both victims had worked at the Golden Dragon restaurant in Chinatown, where 2 years prior there was a gangland shooting where a number of people were murdered. We were concerned that there could have been gang activity, that these guys were followed down to Santa Cruz and were shot and killed on the way over to the beach. An interpreter, Mr. Liu.
Through an interpreter from the San Francisco Police Department's Asian Gang Task Force, the manager of the restaurant described the 2 young men as decent, hard-working employees. In fact, he last saw them the day before they were found murdered. It was payday, and the men were anxious to receive their checks. They had made plans to take a day trip down to Laguna Beach. The manager didn't believe the two men were involved in any gang activity. He could think of no one who would have wanted to harm them. Having found no connection between the victims, detectives realized they were powerless to prevent more killings.
We got a photo of our...
Soon, the investigation into the murders of Mark Farrell, Chek Chin, and Han Lee had hit a dead end.
The case was very frustrating. We had the bullets linking the murders. We knew what type of gun we were looking for. We had a lot of evidence in the case, but we didn't have even a glimmer of why these three people were killed.
But a year and a half later, all of that changed. A man named Dave Bonin contacted police. His daughter, Lynn, he said, was in great danger. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Mark Cunningham, and now he was stalking her. The daughter feared for her life. Mark Cunningham had allegedly bragged about killing 3 men a year and a half earlier.
Okay, thanks.
It was the break police had been waiting for. The father took them to speak with Lynn at the grocery store where she worked. His daughter was afraid to speak to police about Cunningham, so he offered to bring her out of the store. But there was just one complication. Mark Cunningham was there, talking to Lynn. Dave Bonin got his daughter's attention and brought her outside. When Detective Dave Deverell heard the suspect was inside, he quickly interviewed Lynn.
And kind of did just the quickest interview on record. You know, we kind of went, Lynn, your dad tells us that your boyfriend may have killed some people, and we need to know what happened.
Lynn told police that a year and a half earlier, she and Mark Cunningham were driving around near Laguna Beach. Suddenly, Mark pulled into a parking spot, claiming he needed cash. He said he'd be right back, but he wouldn't tell her where he was going. Lynn told police he was gone for several minutes. She recalled that when he returned, he was agitated and out of breath. She thought she saw a gun in his possession. Police realized it was the same spot where the 2 Asian men were found murdered.
It became apparent to us in this real brief interview with Lynn, Mark was the guy we were looking for.
As Lynn finished telling her story, Mark Cunningham exited the store. In a wide-open parking lot, there was any number of ways the suspect could escape. And if Mark Cunningham was in fact the killer, police feared he would not hesitate to use violence. After a year and a half, police in Santa Cruz, California finally had a solid lead in 3 unsolved homicides.
Why don't you guys come on over here?
Mark Cunningham had allegedly bragged to his ex-girlfriend that he was responsible for the shooting deaths. Cunningham was cooperative and taken into custody without incident.
All right, what is this for? I tell you, it's a good style.
Under
Mark,
questioning, he insisted he knew nothing about any of the murders.
I'm sorry, I really.
He claimed that his girlfriend, Lynn Bonin, was trying to get back at him for ending the relationship. He denied owning a Great Western single-action revolver, the type of weapon used in the 3 killings. Police didn't believe him, but they had no hard evidence to prove he was lying. Still, Cunningham remained in police custody. When a few days passed with no additional leads, police turned to his ex-girlfriend for more information. Lynn Bonin had reason to believe that Cunningham had committed the murders.
We just threw it over.
She said that a few days after the 2 men were found murdered at Laguna Beach, Cunningham admitted to the crimes.
What are you going to do about it? Come here.
Then, without warning, he pulled out an old revolver and forced Lynn to the ground. He threatened to kill her and her father if she ever said anything to police. A short while later, Cunningham got rid of the revolver.
He just told me to sit there and wait.
Lynn didn't know anything about Mark Farrell, the 20-year-old man who had been shot and burned in his car along a mountain road.
Mark, at some point, did Mark leave?
I don't know.
However, in the past, she and Cunningham and some friends would hang out on that road and have bonfires. Cunningham would often brandish his weapon at passers-by who complained about the illegal fires. Police had strong circumstantial evidence linking Mark Cunningham to the scenes where all 3 victims had been found murdered. Now they needed hard evidence. They turned to the tire tread marks found at Laguna Beach nearly 2 years earlier. The tires from the truck that had been driven at the time of the murders had been sold, but police were able to track down the current owners. The tires were collected and forwarded to the crime lab for analysis. First, examiners generated an inked impression of Cunningham's tire treads. Then, transparent overlays were placed on top of life-size photographs of the tire tread found at Laguna Beach nearly 2 years earlier. They found that all of the class characteristics, including the shape, size, and dimensions of the tread design, lined up perfectly. The evidence had placed Mark Cunningham's vehicle at the scene of the double murder. But to tie him to all 3 homicides, they needed to find the murder weapon. Lynn Bonin agreed to help. She brought investigators to the area where she believed the gun had been tossed. It appeared to be a waste of time. But then, buried under dirt and debris, they found a pistol. It was a rare Great Western single-action revolver. To prove it was the murder weapon, police forwarded the evidence to forensic examiners. Ballistics expert Paul Doherty knew it would not be easy. Rust had severely damaged the weapon. But after days of cleaning the revolver, he was able to get the gun to fire.
3, 2, 1, fire. Firing.
Ballistics tests proved that the gun was used in both the Laguna Beach murders and the death of 20-year-old Mark Farrell. Cunningham was subsequently charged with 3 counts of murder. Police theorized that Cunningham had started a small bonfire by the side of the road. Mark Farrell, headed home after a long night of work, saw the flames and stopped to find out what was going on. Without warning, Cunningham pulled his gun and shot the young man several times. In an effort to cover his tracks, Cunningham then doused the car with a flammable substance, then set the vehicle on fire. It was a crime of opportunity, one the killer would repeat several weeks later at Laguna Beach. Mark Cunningham was tried and convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Mark Cunningham preyed on victims who happened to cross his path. But in Richmond, Virginia, one killer carefully looked for targets that shared something in common. On the morning of September 19, 1987, a man noticed a car with its engine running pulled up onto the sidewalk. It appeared the vehicle had been abandoned. The man called police. 911 dispatchers ran a check on the tags and learned the car was registered to a woman who lived a few blocks away from where the vehicle was found. But when efforts to contact her failed, police tracked down her landlord. An officer was dispatched to the residence. The landlord was also concerned. She had noticed a missing window screen and feared the place had been burglarized. Not knowing what to expect, the officer cautiously made his way through the apartment. In the bedroom, he made a gruesome discovery. A woman lay dead.
Dispatch, come back.
She had been tied up and strangled. Within minutes, Richmond police and crime scene technicians were dispatched to the scene. The woman, found fully clothed, was identified as 35-year-old Donna Doyle.
Still there, yeah.
No items appeared to be missing. Robbery was not the motive behind the murder. Believing the killer had gained access to the residence through the window, technicians scoured the area for prints. But they found nothing. And the victim's car, which had likely been taken by the killer and then abandoned, yielded no additional clues. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the death had resulted from ligature strangulation. The device had been fashioned from a sock, shoestring, and vacuum cleaner pipe. Donna Doyle had been slowly strangled. Though the victim was clothed in cut-off jeans and a shirt, there were indications she had been sexually assaulted. Biological evidence of rape and some stray hairs were collected. At the time, DNA testing was in its infancy, and all serologists could determine was that the killer had type O blood. Homicide Detective Ray Williams was assigned the case. He realized this investigation would not be simple.
I worked homicide for 20-some odd years in the city, and after looking and reviewing the scene, I knew it to be a very unusual homicide. The way she was tied and strangled was very apparent to me that at that point we weren't dealing with an ordinary killer.
Hoping for more detailed information, the hairs recovered from Donna Doyle's body were forwarded to forensic experts at the Virginia Division of Forensic Science. They determined that 2 of the hairs had not originated from the victim. And from their texture and cross-sectional shape, examiners concluded they had come from an African-American male. For investigators, it wasn't much to go on. To learn more, detectives questioned the employer of a local bookstore where Donna Doyle worked. On the day of the murder, Donna had worked her regular shift. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened that day. She described Donna as a dedicated employee and a very likable person, although she was somewhat shy. After closing the store, Donna headed home. Her employer didn't know if she had plans that night. She believed that Donna lived alone and was unaware if she currently had a boyfriend. After 2 weeks, detectives had no luck identifying a suspect or an obvious motive. The investigation into Donna Doyle's murder was going nowhere. Then, emergency dispatchers received a 911 call. There had been another homicide. As police in Richmond, Virginia struggled to solve the brutal rape and murder of 35-year-old Donna Doyle, they received word of another homicide. The victim, identified as 32-year-old Dr. Stephanie Harris, was discovered inside the bedroom closet by her husband. The scene was less than 2 miles from the site of Donna Doyle's murder. Her hands and feet were bound, and a cloth belt was wrapped tightly around her neck. She had been sexually assaulted. For police, the crime scene looked eerily familiar. There were no indications of robbery, and it appeared the killer had entered through a window. But few clues to his identity were found. The victim's husband explained that he discovered his wife around 2 a.m. upon returning from Maryland, where he was a law student. He had no idea who could have done this. He was later cleared as a suspect. Police sensed the 2 murders were connected. To find out, Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro began examining Dr. Stephanie Harris. She found broken blood vessels in the victim's eyes, called petechial hemorrhages. Like the Donna Doyle case, that suggested Stephanie Harrison had been strangled slowly.
When the victims were examined, there were certain patterns of injuries that were common, and those patterns included evidence of restraint, evidence of strangulation, evidence of injury that took place over a period of time, which was very disturbing because it would indicate a pattern of torture.
The similarities between the crimes led authorities to believe that the same sadistic killer had committed both murders.
When you do autopsies, you get some insight into the nature of the person who committed the crimes. It was apparent from the injuries, from the restraints, and from their physical findings that these were very cruel deaths and that they were committed by somebody who enjoyed doing it.
The biological evidence recovered from Stephanie Harrison was sent to forensic serologists. An analysis revealed that those samples and the ones collected from Donna Doyle shared the same blood type. Both were type O.
Okay, folks, let's fall in and conduct.
Richmond police were certain that the same killer, dubbed by the press as the South Side Strangler, had committed both murders.
We've got the evening watch. Our target is
And having found no obvious connection between the two victims, it appeared he chose his victims randomly. They feared he would strike again. The question now was where and when.
Which is known as the River Channel.
They got their answer 2 months later. On November 22nd, 1987, police just a few miles outside of Richmond in Chesterfield County were dispatched to the scene of a murder. The victim, 15-year-old Dawn Chang, had been viciously raped and strangled in her bedroom. Like the other cases, the perpetrator had entered the bedroom through the window.
Here's what we got, the 8.
Strangely, investigators found a figure 8 painted on the victim's body. But aside from a few stray hairs, little physical evidence was recovered. However, the hairs were enough for authorities to conclude that Dawn Chang had been the South Side Strangler's third victim. Unlike the other victims, Dawn was a teenager. She was Asian, and she didn't live alone. In fact, her parents were sleeping in the next room at the time of the murder. They never heard a thing. They described their daughter as a typical teenager.
It's a recent picture.
Great, time for me to get back to work.
You have a lot of work to do?
Yes.
They last saw her the night before.
Go study.
After dinner, Dawn said she had some homework to do and planned on going to bed after she finished. She said goodnight and went to her bedroom. The mother discovered her daughter's lifeless body the following morning. Authorities had a serial killer on the loose, and he appeared to be spreading out beyond the Richmond city limits. His ability to avoid detection led police to believe he had done this before. Desperate to generate a lead, Detective Ray Williams contacted police departments throughout the region, looking for any unsolved cases with a similar MO. Less than 100 miles away, in the Washington, D.C. suburb of Arlington, Virginia, he got a hit. There, Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington County Police Department had several unsolved rapes and murders that went back nearly 3 years. The details of those were frighteningly similar to the murders in Richmond and Chesterfield County. 3 weeks after 15-year-old Dawn Chang's homicide, Arlington County Police had been dispatched to the home of Sandra Thomas.
Watch where we're stepping.
The 34-year-old woman had been discovered raped and murdered in her home. She lived alone, and like the victims in Richmond, she had been strangled with household items. From hairs and biological evidence recovered from the scene, police determined that Sandra Thomas's killer was an African-American male with type O blood. The other unsolved crimes in Arlington with a similar MO had been committed in 1984. At first, it seemed odd to Detective Horgus that the killer would suddenly stop, only to resume 3 years later.
He didn't stop because he's got a girlfriend. He didn't stop because he got married. He stopped because he either relocated, he's dead, and he's not dead if he's doing the other ones, or he's in prison.
Detective Horgus reviewed recent parole and probation records, looking for African-American males who were arrested in Arlington in 1984. Then he found something. In early 1984, a 21-year-old man named Timothy W. Spencer was arrested in connection with a series of breaking and entering and petty thefts. Though those were non-violent crimes, records also indicated he was identified as the prime suspect in a series of unsolved rapes throughout Arlington. However, he was never charged with those crimes. After serving 3 years on the theft charges, Spencer was paroled. And that wasn't all.
His probation officer here in Arlington knew that he was released from prison to a halfway house down in Richmond. And he was released about 2 weeks before the first murder.
If Detective Horgus was right, Timothy Spencer was now the prime suspect in at least 4 murders throughout Virginia. But unless investigators could physically link him to the crimes, he would remain free to kill again. Police in Arlington, Virginia had finally identified a suspect in a series of unsolved rapes and murders that spanned a 3-year period. And those homicides bore an eerie resemblance to a string of serial murders taking place 100 miles away in Richmond.
All right, here's Tucker's hams.
To find out if they were dealing with the same predator, Arlington County Homicide Detective Joe Horgus traveled to Richmond. There, he teamed up with Detective Ray Williams. After comparing the details of all the homicides, there could be little doubt that the same killer had committed all of the crimes. The detectives learned that their prime suspect, Timothy Spencer, had been recently paroled and was currently living in a halfway house in Richmond. According to the director of the house, the suspect was currently out running errands. Detectives asked to see the logbook that contained the times and dates of when a parolee leaves and returns to the house. According to the records, Timothy Spencer had signed himself out on September 18th, October 2nd, and November 21st. Dates that corresponded to the murders in Richmond and Chesterfield County. He had also signed out on November 25th to spend Thanksgiving weekend with his mother in Arlington. Arlington County Detective Joe Horgus realized that Timothy Spencer's mother lived just a few blocks from where the latest victim, Sandra Thomas, had been murdered that same weekend.
What are the odds that 100 miles away, our lady up here that's murdered, M.O. fits identical to theirs down there, and where's Timothy Spencer? He's up here at the same time. Too many coincidences just don't add up. What it adds up to is logic. This is our man.
A short while later, Timothy Spencer returned home. And police were there waiting. The suspected serial killer was taken into custody on suspicion of murder.
Hand behind your bed. He'll tell you just something.
A search of his room at the halfway house failed to produce any hard evidence linking him to the murders. But on his bed, they discovered a drawing of a figure 8, similar to the one found painted on the body of 15-year-old Dawn Chang.
to show you a couple
Under
pictures.
questioning,
This will
Spencer admitted nothing.
jog your memory a little bit. So see if you recognize these folks, okay? Do you know that person? No.
He claimed to have no knowledge about any rapes or murders.
Have you ever been to
And he denied drawing the figure 8 found on his bed. Detectives sensed he was lying, and now they looked to the forensic evidence for proof. Hair and blood samples were collected from the suspect. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science, criminalists compared the hairs taken from Spencer to those recovered from several of the crime scenes. The shape, size, color, and texture of the hairs were identical. Though Timothy Spencer had type O blood, so did millions of other people. For irrefutable proof that he was the South Side Strangler, examiners turned to a newly developed, more sophisticated type of analysis called DNA testing. The testing revealed that the genetic profile of the suspect was identical to the ones generated from the biological evidence left behind at 4 murder scenes. The chances that the killer was someone other than Timothy Spencer were nearly 900 million to 1. He was charged with 4 counts of murder. Investigators theorized that after randomly choosing his prey, Spencer, an experienced burglar, would slip silently through his victims' windows. Once inside, he raped and strangled them. Timothy Spencer was sentenced to death for the murders of Donna Doyle, Dr. Stephanie Harrison, and Dawn Chang in Richmond, and for the death of Sandra Thomas in Arlington. He was the first person in the United States to be executed on the basis of DNA fingerprinting. For Richmond homicide detective Ray Williams, the new forensic technology could not have come along at a better time.
Were it not for DNA evidence, Timothy Spencer would have never been convicted. See, when you put a case before a jury, the jury has to see, touch, feel, and hear. We didn't have a whole lot of things for them to see, touch, feel, and hear, other than DNA. And that DNA spoke for itself.
Some killers require no motive at all to commit their crimes. And for homicide detectives, identifying a suspect can be a challenge. In those cases, they must rely on the physical evidence to expose a killer who has set his sights on random targets.